Hello and welcome to the channel. In today's episode, I'm building a memorial flag display case for my wife's stepfather who passed away in June of 2022. This is a relatively straightforward project and accessible for beginning woodworkers, so let's get started. For this project, I'm beginning by planing the boards down to the final thickness. The wood I'm using is sapili, which is a relative of mahogany. It can be prone to tear out, so I'm taking very light passes and monitoring the material I remove by marking the surface between each pass. These light passes also make sanding easier since it smooths the surface and I can start with a higher sandpaper grit. After checking my blade for squareness to the saw top, I cut the base of the triangle to length on my miter gauge. It took me a couple of tries to get my marks exactly how I wanted them, and then I had to sneak up on the mark to get the exact length that I was looking for. Since the rest of the triangle dimensions are dependent on the length of the base, it needed to be exact. I realized there are other ways to cut these angles, but since these boards are narrow and I knew my blade was perfectly 90 degrees, I felt comfortable using my precision fence. If you don't have a precision fence, you can accomplish these angles by setting the blade at 45 degrees and then cross-cutting your boards. Using a drafting triangle, I mark the sides for length using relative dimensioning, not a rule or tape measure. Relative dimensioning is when you use the workpiece itself to determine your cut length. By using relative dimensioning, I can get an exact fit without the guesswork, which makes these cuts much easier to get right. I verify the cuts against the triangle again, just in case I need to make a slight adjustment. I recommend every woodworker have some drafting tools in their collection. They're relatively inexpensive, but very accurate. This case requires a stopped groove for the acrylic and a rabbet for the back cover panel, which I made on my router table. If you don't have a router table, these cuts can be accomplished with a hand router. When I decided initially to make these videos, I wasn't going to do a voiceover, and I was going to let the videos speak for themselves. So here I'm showing the grit of sandpaper I'm using to sand the insides of the frame, since they won't be accessible after assembly. Since I was careful with the planer, I can start with 220 grit, and then finish with 320 grit. If you don't have a planer that'll give you a nearly sanded finish, you'll have to start with a lower grit, which will vary with the roughness of your boards. To glue the top corner of the triangle, which is at 90 degrees, I'm using a positioning square, CA glue, and accelerator, and Titebond quick and thick glue. The CA glue will hold the joint together while the Titebond dries, which will take about 15 minutes or so. But really Titebond, quick and thick, my inner 12-year-old is dying. Though the glue is probably sufficient once fully cured, I am a belt and suspenders kind of guy, so I'm reinforcing the joint with 3-penny finish nails. I'll countersink these at least a 1/16 of an inch so I can fill and hide them. I'll be covering how to fill nail holes, voids, and gaps in another video, so if you'd like to see that one and you've received some education or entertainment value from this video, I'd love to have you like and subscribe. It'll really help the channel. And here you can see the frame with the acrylic installed and clamped up as the glue cures. I built this weird bracket a long time ago to hold some scuba tanks, and I've nearly discarded it several times, but every time I do, something like this pops up where I can use it as a brace. This display requires 2 pedestal bases, which I'm cutting to initial length and width. I use a high-quality combination blade for a lot of my projects, which saves time since I can both rip and cross-cut without having to change out the blade. Unfortunately, my older saw didn't come with a riving knife, but I have one from an aftermarket third party that I can install when I change operations. Of course, you can use dedicated rip and crosscut blades if that's your preference. Here I will route the 45-degree chamfer and then cross-cut the pieces in half later. For safety reasons, I didn't want to use the hand router once the pieces had been cut short. And again with the sanding. Unfortunately, it's unavoidable and really necessary to a quality finished product. I mean, unless you're one of those guys that likes to hand plane to get your final surface. There's nothing wrong with that. I just don't have that many planes or that much patience. These will be sanded to 220 and then 320 grit. I use a white chalk pencil to mark darker boards so I can see where I've been with the sander, and then I vacuum between grits. This ensures I don't leave pieces of coarser grit on the board, which can leave sanding marks that'll show once the final finish is applied. While I'm here, let me say that I'll include website links in the video description for everything I use in this video. Some of these are affiliate links, which won't cost you any extra if you decide to buy from them. But since I don't have any sponsorships, not even Titebond, those links will really help me out and let me make more content for you. By cutting the bases to length after shaping and sanding, I do stand a risk of some tear out, but I avoided that by being very careful on my cut and slowing way down as the board exited the blade. Your results with this technique will vary with type and condition of your blade and the wood species. I've added a scrap wood spacer block between the two pedestal bases, and I'm assembling with CA glue, accelerator, and Titebond Quick and Thick using my universal glue spreader. I'm using 3-2-1 blocks to help create a 1-inch space on the front edge. With the two pedestals assembled, I'll mark and then drill and countersink for screws that'll reinforce the connection between the two bases and the display frame. Using painter's tape, I mark the center of the display frame and then make a corresponding center mark on the scrap wood spacer. I use the thickness of my red positioning squares to set the distance from the back of the upper level of the pedestals to the back of the display frame. The 3-2-1 blocks make good anchors to help keep the squares and frame tight to each other. CA glue, accelerator, and Titebond will secure the mount initially. Now that the pedestals are in place, I can remove the scrap wood spacer block. I also hop on the struggle bus for a few seconds since it was a tight fit and I was taking it out with only one hand. To reinforce the glue connection between the frame and the pedestals, I install some screws by hand. I don't like using power drivers on small projects like this because I want to ensure I don't overdrive or split anything. The display case still needs a plywood backer installed, so I measure and mark for the cut with a square and a good straight edge on a piece of 1/4-inch Baltic birch cabinet grade plywood. I then use a track saw to cut along the line. I don't have a dedicated track saw, but I do have a decent circular saw and a really good blade, which I paired with a Craig kit that lets me use my circular saw for precision cuts. Once the cut is made, I check for fit in both directions, as sometimes slight variances can impact how a piece goes together. Screw holes for the backer come next. Spacing isn't super critical here, but my OCD self wanted good symmetry, so I measured and marked to ensure I could match the placements from side to side. I'm using 1/2-inch number 4 screws, but even though they're supposed to be 1/2-inch number 4s, I'll still check the drill bit against the screws themselves for insurance, and then place a piece of tape on the bit as a depth guide. Once the holes are drilled, I will follow up with a countersink bit so the screw heads will be recessed flush when installed. You could also use picture frame clips to hold the backer instead of screwing the back directly to the frame if you choose. A quick test that all the screws are good with no tear out, and it's on to the next step. Oh, sanding, how I love thee, let me count the ways. In this case, it's the ways of 220 grit 3M Cubitron 2. Again, not sponsored. I'm just telling you what I'm using. A lot of woodworkers, and not just the ones on YouTube, have found this 3M product to be exceptional, and I'm no exception. It's my understanding that this is an outgrowth of 3M's super high quality automotive bodywork products. I frequently apply a pre-stain conditioner when using plywood depending on the species, since even some hardwood plywoods can be subject to blotching when stained. It goes on quick and dries quick, so it doesn't really hurt production time and can save a lot of resanding and fixing later. I'm also using a water-based opaque stain here in black onyx color. It wipes on and wipes off and is easy to clean up if I make a big mess. The water does sometimes have a tendency to raise the grain, but I can usually knock that back down and smooth it right out. Of course, this is the back and will be covered by the flag, so it's not super critical that everything be absolutely perfect, but I do make sure that all of the edges are nice and dark and uniform in color. A quick shot of semi-gloss lacquer brings out the phenomenal grain that's present in sapili wood. Everything, including both sides of the backer board, the inside of the frame, the bottom, and the inside edges of the pedestals, will end up getting a full 3 coats. And here's the finished product. I just love the look of finished sapili. Again, if you found value in this video, I'd love for you to like, subscribe, and comment. I really do look for your feedback. And as a reward for sticking it out to the end of this video, if you put my name, Ben, at the beginning of your comment, I'll be sure to reply to yours first. Thanks again, and I'll see you again real soon.